This conversation was recorded live on stage at the Festival of Dangerous Ideas, a festival co-presented by the Ethics Centre and the UNSW Centre for Ideas.
And here we are with the amazing writer and cultural critic Angela Nagle, the author of Kill All Normies. It's a book in which she looks into alt-right culture and how it's moved out of its online territory and into the mainstream media. Once it was confined to the message boards of 4chan, and now we see figures like Richard Spencer who advocate for a white America on prime television. Some say it's too dangerous to discuss the ideas of the alt-right, but it's been influencing politics and events around the world in very real ways. To understand the alt-right is to understand our political landscape. Unlike the traditional right, with its conservative Christian morals, the alt-right is anti-establishment, provocative, offensive, transgressive. It stands for absolute free speech, no matter how prejudiced. And in turn, that creates a culture of dark humour, which knows no boundaries. Of course, alongside the rise of these alt-right jokesters, an earnest and sensitive left has also been growing, and that end of the spectrum is into no platforming, calling out prejudice and public shaming, often of their own teammates. So we have the two sides fighting a culture war that Angela Nagle has been covering. And while others are carving out personal social media brands by employing the usual tactics of left or right, Angela Nagle transcends it all. Her work evades easy categorization. As Slavoj Žižek said, no one is spared in her razor-sharp critical probing. So it's with great pleasure that I introduce Angela Nagle, a truly unique thinker who has been described as having declared her independence from intellectual conformity. Indeed, her writing can't be boxed into any political camp. Ladies and gentlemen, Angela.
Oh, thank you. I'm always scanning the crowd at the start to figure out who's going to be saying terrible things about me afterwards. So, a year and a half ago, I brought out a book from which this event takes its name, Kill All Normies. I tried to describe the symbiotic and mutually reinforcing relationship between two online subcultural styles. I thought styles was the best way of putting it, because at that time, and maybe since, it's been something quite fluid and something quite different from a kind of an old-fashioned political movement, which has to have concrete aims and so on. So these emerged in the years prior to the online culture wars reaching the kind of fevered state that they're at today. Both went on to be even more influential than I anticipated, both kind of sides in this culture war. On one side, you had the culture of sites like Tumblr. There, though of course not exclusively there, a style of a kind of radical liberal cultural politics flourished, which has since come to really influence, if not dominate, kind of liberal public discourse. If you think about even things like privilege checking and so on, a lot of the political language and styles and ideas originated in corners of the internet that people once said to me when I started studying this stuff were totally wacky and would never be important, and it was just some kind of a moral panic if you were paying attention to them. It was one of ever-growing variations. The culture of kind of Tumblr was one of ever-growing variations of kind of personal identification around gender and sexuality, a focus on personal experiences of pain and trauma, a kind of self-flagellating, self-criticism culture about one's own identity and identitarian privilege. On the other side, there was the culture of 4chan. There was a kind of exactly the opposite, essentially, a culture of irreverence, shock, transgression, and a kind of anti-political correctness, which developed its own language, its own image style, and its own genres, and which later spread and kind of cross-pollinated with a whole range of other anti-PC subcultures, so the manosphere and different things like that. By the time the US presidential race came around, both subcultures encapsulated the radical youth subcultural kind of vanguard of a broader political divide between an unapologetic nationalism and kind of macho, straight-talking, anti-PC politics embodied in somebody like Trump, and the maybe somebody like Bolsonaro more recently, and then the liberal feminist identity politics of Hillary, who famously drew mainstream attention to the other side by calling them deplorables. I always thought this was a very ineffective insult, which of course they loved. So much has happened since the release of the book a year and a half ago. I see it now as a kind of a short snapshot of a very important moment in online politics, rather than as a general explanation of what is now really a global phenomenon of the rise of the far right and the populist right and so on. The political and imaginative energy on both sides, both of these two sides, from the time I started looking at it, has morphed and moved around to different platforms. The far right and populist right has made massive electoral gains, while the ultra-PC leftism that was once confined to the quirky corners of the web has now become part of the mainstream liberal media landscape and discourse. The kind of ultra-woke Tumblr left now makes up a kind of precarious reserve army of freelance journalists employed by every liberal youth-oriented publication. For the last couple of months, I've been living in Bushwick in Brooklyn in New York, and that's basically where all those people live now. And they all write for, well, I don't want to get in trouble with too many publications, but they write for the Daily Beast, they write for BuzzFeed, they write for Vice, and so on. So again, this is an elaborate me telling you I told you so, but basically the people who are once considered, they're not worth looking at, it's just Tumblr, they're just crazy kids, are now staffing in a freelance way a lot of the media that really shapes public opinion. Then on the other side, in the kind of post-Charlottesville purge, much of the more politically serious alt-right people have been purged from social media platforms, taken down from various ones, and generally kicked out of the public square. It also, in a way, created a divide between those who were politically serious and those who were just ironic kind of trolls, who many of whom kind of went running as soon as it became obvious that this was actually a real political movement with real consequences. So the book was also a critique of what I saw as a conflict rooted in the cultural turn in politics that really emerged in the 1970s. This was a general move towards doing politics through culture. Marxists were actually among the best critics of the cultural turn, which is why I'm always critical of the idea that the cultural turn's kind of contemporary manifestation is somehow a product of Marxism. So despite all the rhetoric about Marxists having taken over because you can't wear a sombrero at Halloween or something like that, within art and culture, lazy assumptions that, shocking bourgeois morality would always be the domain of the left took hold kind of in the course of the period of the cultural turn. One of the reasons many progressives thought the politics emerging from 4chan were actually just clever, ironic counterculture was because they couldn't believe that right-wingers could do it too. But because the left won the culture war and lost the economic war, during this period it made sense that the right got back in touch with its own avant-garde tradition, which goes back to Marinetti and the Italian futurists who are fascists, avant-garde. Operating entirely within the value system of the cultural turn left, avant-gardists on the alt-right were able to shock, disrupt, question moral norms, and subvert mainstream narratives, right? All the things that that art and culture has kind of been praised for in recent decades. They were able to do all of those things, but to further their own kind of politics. So instead of attacking religious conservatives, like maybe Piss Christ did or something like that, cultural conservatism, in my view, is basically kind of effectively dead as a cultural force. So it's actually not, it's not really a very risky thing to do at this point, to challenge conservative morality. So instead, they attacked secular liberal faith beliefs and shibboleths of our time. So that included attacking women, gays, minorities, ideas like diversity, equality, feminism, and so on. So in the book, I posed the question, if this is how shallow the transgressive counterculturalism of the cultural turn has become, if it can be adapted so much and requires you to be always marginal to mainstream culture, always oppositional to the mainstream, to the masses, to the normies, and so on, when presumably the goal of politics is to win the mainstream, then should we revisit its usefulness as a mode of doing politics altogether? The reason I did that was because I didn't want to do the easy takeaway of saying, oh, if you want to challenge them, then you have to be more, rule-breaking and transgressive and so on. I thought it was the harder takeaway and the more interesting takeaway to say, is there something fundamentally really that necessary about, or even that, really transcendent about doing politics in this way? So I felt like my book was a kind of call to sanity, and it was interpreted in this way by a lot of the early reviews that came out. So what am I doing at a festival of dangerous ideas? Shouldn't the extreme people that I was writing about be up here instead? Well, the bizarre thing is that my book somehow became wildly controversial. It provoked personal hit pieces against me, character assassinations, a deranged and obsessed cohort of online attackers dedicated to sometimes hilariously dishonest misinterpretations of everything I've ever said. Some of them go online almost daily for over a year now, just to convince the world that I'm an evil person. Some of them transcribe my every word on podcasts and in interviews, and they highlight the lines that could potentially be used in evidence against me in my future social media trials. Some demanded to know what my publishers, employers, and my old university were going to do to punish me. They asked to speak off the record with people and so on. The embarrassing truth about the year and a half that has passed since Kill All Normies, which I haven't really talked about until now because I knew it would spark a whole new wave of attacks. And it's not that I'm afraid of them necessarily, but by now I am truly bored of them, is that I wrote a book which had elements of criticism of all of my subjects and elements of empathy for all of my subjects, and certainly plenty of criticism for the alt-right. But it has overwhelmingly been attacked from the kind of woke Tumblr side. All of the most vicious attacks have come from there. When I was preparing for the book to come out, I lost a lot of sleep thinking about, are the alt-right going to hack my emails, imagining all the terrible things that would happen. And I definitely didn't expect that a year and a half later I would still be dealing with, ostensibly my own side, giving me the hardest time. So shortly after it came out, I remember a feminist academic saying to me, "I hope you're engaging in self-care." Now, of course, I would never do such a thing. But I did think, I will need to after a while. It will probably be you that's forcing me to. So don't get me wrong. I, of course, did get nasty stuff sent to me and said about me and so on by the far right. Some of the people in the manosphere, for example, called me a hysterical social justice warrior. At the same time, the Tumblr faction were calling me a fascist, or more niche and inventive things like the Laura Ingraham of Strasserites. That's a little obscure, you'll have to look that one up. They've said, for example, that I think all transgression is bad, as if anyone actually holds that opinion. And that therefore I'm a sort of generalized reactionary and bigot. When I've tried to debate people on the right, they said I was sharing a platform with them and therefore I'm in total agreement with them. They've said my book's thesis is that Tumblr single-handedly caused the rise of the right across the world. They've said my book's thesis is that the electoral victories of the right were solely caused by the internet, and then argued against these sort of straw man. They've claimed my book is pro-alt-right. One friend of mine, when he eventually got around to reading it, was surprised to find that it was actually highly critical because he had seen the kind of crazy response to it. They've compared me to whoever the hated figures of the day are. So Jonathan Chait, Jordan Peterson, Ross Douthat, Alexander Dugin was an interesting one, Hitler, of course, who are all basically the same person in the imagination of this kind of online faction. Of course, none of this is true, and even a glance at the book, the contents page perhaps, will kind of make that obvious. But the important thing is not to get stuck in the argument of proving that it's untrue, but to simply understand the nature of the tactic, which has everything to do with the nature of the internet and social media. The purging tactic is, which has been accelerated by social media, is all about singling out a person for public humiliation. John Ronson, of course, wrote a little bit ahead of the curve on this about the way in which the whole culture of public shaming was really influencing our entire public debate and bringing out the worst, absolute worst in everyone. So in other words, really, that faction have proven my criticisms of them true over and above what I could have possibly imagined. So I don't want any of this to sound like self-pity. In fact, in many ways, I welcome their hatred. But I do worry about where all of this is going for kind of public discourse and society in general. It's very hard to imagine now a figure like, while I'm in Australia, Robert Hughes, or a figure like Gore Vidal, where a young Robert Hughes or a young Gore Vidal would fit in the world of political discourse. Now we simply have tribes who recognize, who understand politics in terms of, is this person a good person or a bad person? Are they my political enemy? And then I will attack them or bond with them accordingly. So any kind of nuance is gone. Any kind of possibility of a good faith debate is gone, I think, really at this point. So the cycle of reaction and counter-reaction among these, broadly speaking, two sides that is constantly fueled by this bad faith culture has made us all more stupid and more cruel. All of the best human traits of kind of truth-seeking and mercy and so on are, have really been kind of purged from the public square in many ways because of the online world. One of the reasons I've, in recent months, taken Jaron Lanier's advice and logged off is that I can really feel myself getting dumber just by looking at the whole spectacle of the online culture wars. You very easily get caught into arguments which are so fundamentally nonsense, and yet they can take up days of your time. You can find yourself cooking your dinner privately, fuming about somebody who was very wrong about something. So we're very quickly approaching a time when no meaningful debate will even be possible, and it's hard to see how we'll ever regain what we've lost. The reason that to these kind of factions, these tribes, I stand out as a confusing political misfit today is simply because of this kind of mind virus of this, I hate to say it, but very Americanized liberal individualism and the politics of the cultural turn, which has kind of infected everything, mixed with the online world of the pleasure of the mob, the pleasure of seeing people humiliated in public, and the pleasure of a lot of people who perhaps don't have that much power in real life ganging up on somebody together and having sort of power in numbers. I see myself politically as straightforwardly in line with the entire tradition of the Labour left, and it's not that hard to understand. A story that is yet to be fully told, but will undoubtedly come out in the fullness of time, is that in the last particularly 2 years or so, I would say, as kind of Trump got elected and the populist right grew and kind of brought things to a point of conflict, there were many great internal critics on the left who tried to, because the phenomenon I'm describing will always be described on the right as a phenomenon of the left, even though it purges its own internal critics. So the left's internal critics who tried to warn against the growing culture of kind of viciousness and vindictiveness that was emerging, of a total dominance of bad faith and personal attacks in lieu of any kind of political discussion, any serious one, of a kind of militant, enforced conformity to liberal identity politics, which have, in recent years, the critics of those in recent years have been driven out of political organizations, driven out of public life, driven out of political commentary, and in many cases driven to completely drop out. Some of our best critics, I would say, that is now true of. So everyone from Slavoj Žižek to someone like Norman Finkelstein, I'm a big fan of both, have been kind of declared not good folks for various off-message or kind of un-PC remarks. the view is that this person must be a bad person if they're saying something that the bad people over there typically say. But as time goes on, more and more evidence is emerging that kind of vindicates a kind of a critique of PC from the left, which many of those critics have been saying for years. So several recent studies have shown the overwhelming hatred the majority of the public has for PC culture across all identity groups, including all of the minority identity groups that all of this is supposed to be for, except for one group, which was elite educated whites. A number of studies have kind of corroborated this, and the numbers are quite staggering. I think it's overall 80%, as a totally oppose PC culture, to use the kind of slightly cliched term. New studies have shown a steep rise in kind of ultra PC woke identity politics among this kind of elite group during the time frame of my book. So really, what was emerging online was, just that one particular online expression of a broader trend that was also appearing in other ways, in kind of polls and things like that. But the problem for me arises when criticizing this is seen as an attack on the left, as some commentators, it probably is for some commentators, but not always. So I've tried to present a critique from a different angle. So I want to say a few words about what I think the right gets wrong when it critiques this kind of style of politics. I think that the conservative and kind of moderate liberal critics of wokeness, to use the kind of, I think that's like a slightly more fun term than PC, get something fundamentally wrong. They believe that all of this represents a lurch to the radical left. That was actually a phrase used in one of the reports of that data that I was talking about. In fact, wokeness is a form of elite social media-fueled social advancement and status seeking. The amusing excesses of the Tumblr teens are no longer funny, as they've gone on to paid positions in the role of those employed by the media in the business of like casual life destroying of political opponents. They are militant enforcers of conformity who seek to simply push an open door to advance a project already entirely supported by global capitalism, by big tech, by finance, by every elite cultural institution. They are a product of the death of the possibility of radical material change, not a radical alternative to any existing system. So on the question of migration and borders, one of the most contentious and kind of painful of our time, as a result, one of the most important, they are virtually indistinguishable from the free market think tanks like the Cato Institute and the Adam Smith Institute, or lobbying groups like Mark Zuckerberg's Forward, funded by some of the biggest players in the entire international capitalist class. On the question of free speech, they are now indistinguishable from the big tech platforms, who recently proved every Alex Jones fan conspiracy theorist nightmares right when they shut him down on multiple platforms in concert all at the same time. However ridiculous you may find Alex Jones, his conspiracies are no more crazy or sinister than what we know now for a fact secret governmental organizations like the CIA actually did during the Cold War, just for example, like manipulating culture through the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which funded artists, radical liberal publications, and all kinds of counterculture to encourage the anti-Soviet left more interested in cultural transgression than in the means of production. We know that they conducted horrifying experiments on people, organized coups around the world to secure US military and economic hegemony. One of the lesser-known outcomes of the current social media purge is that while liberal identity politics completely dominates the mainstream media now, media outlets of the left have also been targeted. It's seen as purely targeting the right, but there have been websites of the left targeted too. What do they all have in common? Most, if not all, are critics of US State Department foreign policy. Of course, none of this makes Jones right about anything, but it does show how the puritanical liberalism at work online produces an appearance of social pressure to deplatform those who imagine there might be conspiracies at work among powerful organizations. It strikes me as exactly the wrong kind of response to say people believe in conspiracies because they're angry, and implicit in that is they shouldn't be angry, when of course they should. On identity politics, they are also indistinguishable from corporate policy now within the world's global monopoly corporations who have set up shop in countries like Ireland, sorry everyone, with the low corporation tax, where staff go to allied training workshops and can get fired for saying unwoke things. Who needs worker protections when you have beanbags and diverse boardrooms? The right wing imagines that we live in a world that is drowning in egalitarianism, that the cathedral of egalitarian ideology has absolute rule. But if this is true, how come actual material inequality, the kind that matters, has only grown during this time of increased egalitarian rhetoric and dogma since the cultural turn? The answer is because liberalism, even and perhaps especially in its current seemingly radical form, cannot produce equality, no matter how much egalitarian rhetoric it does produce. And that's what the whole social justice warrior phenomenon is. It's not Marxism, but the most militant mode of enforcing liberalism at a time when the public is rejecting it and moving more towards the populist right. The system needs something a little stronger than enlightenment values and so on to ensure that people kind of stay in line. When many moderate liberal and conservative critics of the online culture wars today talk of right and left, they miss something fundamental. The true defeat of conservatism came from within in the form of the market liberalizers of the Reagan and Thatcher era, whose vision of the world has now fused perfectly with that of the cultural liberalizers of '68. Equally, the defeat of the historic mission of the left also came from within, in the form of the third-way politics of Blair and Clinton, which made its peace with capitalism, but made all the right noises about equality and liberalization in the sphere of culture and identity. Critics like Christopher Lasch saw all of this coming decades ago. His critique of the culture of narcissism reads today like an eerie prophecy, not just of the direction that modern liberal individualism took, but of how social media has accelerated the worst atomization and fragile egotism of progressive individualism, and how lost we all are in a world where there is no society, only the individual. It is also the cultural politics of defeat rather than radicalism. Having made the left's genuinely radical material demands impossible, it gives us the crumbs of culture. So, the left led an anti-war movement in the lead up to the Iraq War. The war happened anyway. The left led a great anti-globalization movement, which had, I think, in my opinion, a much more egalitarian and kind of humane vision of a critique of globalization than exists today, which is, taking the form of the kind of populist right. It led a movement against Wall Street, in Occupy Wall Street, and financialization continued uninterrupted. And of course, it led the labor movement, which completely reshaped the world in the 20th century. And that was, at least perhaps not fully defeated, but certainly disempowered in a major way too. So the system has shut down every potential avenue for challenging its power and addressing real inequality. Now we have a far-right backlash, which is doubly tragic because it's a backlash against a fake and ineffective egalitarianism in the form of that kind of Tumblr-ized PC left. The right-wing backlash is against an egalitarian tyranny that is fundamentally unreal. If the left can find a way, admittedly against overwhelming odds, to fight first the radical liberal imposters within their own ranks, which will guarantee their electoral devastation in one country after the next as the populist right sweeps the world. If it returns to its historic mission of fighting for the material interests of ordinary people instead, it may have a chance of reversing the course of history which we are currently on. If it fails, the future will be a battle between the current system of deepening inequality, social breakdown with a human face, and the far right. And we will look back a long time from now and long for a time when all your ideological opponents could do was publicly shame you online.
Thank you, Angela. Thank you, Angela. We're taking questions from the audience, so if you'd like to ask Angela something, please make your way to one of the microphones. Friendly reminder, questions end in question marks. And if you could try and keep it succinct so we can get through as many people as possible and keep the conversation flowing, that would be great. Angela, you criticise and sympathise with the left just as much as you do with the right. That's pretty rare today, even for journalists. Where do you sit on the political spectrum yourself?
I see myself very much on the left, but I also recognise that, unfortunately, because of the transformation of the left in the last sort of half century, when I speak to people on the right, I realize that what they mean by the left is really the liberalization of culture, which is not something I'm particularly interested in, or is not something I feel is a particularly difficult struggle or something like that now. I see myself, I guess, as a kind of like a Benite kind of Labour leftist.
What is it about liberalism that you're not into?
I guess it's just, as I said, it's like pushing an open door, kind of. I think it's always good to try to honestly look at where kind of power really lies, and to kind of question that. And you will always find pushback when you do that. So, for example, it's very common. It's very common if you look at, say, like contemporary, like feminist analysis, to describe the contemporary world as patriarchal. If you actually honestly try to look at the landscape of contemporary culture, you could say, men are retreating at an incredible level away from the traditional male roles, and have been actually for quite a while. So they're not all dying to be, tyrannical fathers. They want to play video games and watch porn. So the point is, it's an easy takeaway. It's saying, I'm against something that was dominant 50 years ago. Aren't I brave, Whereas actually the difficult thing to say is, now we have a completely new set of problems, and it's not patriarchal, it's kind of the opposite in a way. It doesn't mean that everything's great, it just means that you have to try to... I just find that a lot of the stuff that I read, the kind of very lazy stuff that I read from my own side, tends to lean on this completely outdated analysis of society that gives the impression we're living in the 1950s, And as I say, it's lazy and it's a little cowardly, because you're not going to get any pushback from that. You can say a statement like that and it will be uncontroversial.
Yeah, and this is pretty dangerous work for you, the publication of your book, coming to an event like this and talking about it. Are you on social media? And you mentioned some of the things in your talk just now about how difficult it is and how you kind of get hit from every side. Can you elaborate on that a little?
Yeah, today is kind of probably the last talk I'll do kind of on this subject. Ordinarily I try to split it kind of half and half, where I talk about the alt-right for half, and then, But because it's called the Festival of Dangerous Ideas, I felt like there was something absurd about me, talking about this group of people who, as I said, have all been deplatformed from social media, or not all, but like almost all, and the last of them will probably go in the coming weeks, deplatformed from kind of the public square and so on, that to pretend that it's brave to criticize or to be a critic of something that's sort of already, been hammered so hard that I just thought that wouldn't, that there would be something a little absurd about that. So I thought it would be more interesting to kind of criticize technically my own side.
Mike, too?
Thanks so much for the talk. I read your book last year and I thought it was really fascinating and really changed the way that I thought about all these questions in online culture. And I went to Twitter to see if I could follow you there, and I think you used to be on Twitter, but you've quit, obviously, because of the backlash. And I just sort of think that is quite unfortunate. My question is, how much of the problem is how these social media platforms are created to sort of encourage really extreme points of view that put people in filter bubbles? I mean, I would prefer to log on to Twitter and follow someone like you who is making an argument that is pissing off people from both sides, which kind of indicates to me that you're probably on the right path in a way there. But instead, you log on and there are all these Alex Jones types. So don't you think that, to a certain extent, some deplatforming of these extremist views is necessary in order for views like that you have to be more prevalent?
Possibly, but the other thing you could say is, instead of deplatforming them, people like me should be thicker skinned and just be on there all the time. And I have thought about that. I mean, I do think, part of me thinks it's a shame that so many interesting people have just completely bowed out of, like, not just social media, but just public debate in general. Like, really, really great writers. I know it's a very sad thing. And when I try to encourage them, you know, and I say, like, I know it's terrible and it's just like banging your head against a brick wall, but, you know, we have to do it. Like, we have to stay in these kind of spaces. But I'm also hypocritical because I have not stayed in them. That's probably what we should do. I guess the problem is that what always happens, like, I often have people, I remember one time when I was going through a particularly nasty kind of round of attacks when I was on Twitter, and I went out to this event where there would have been lots of journalists and stuff like that, and I had people come over and say kind of, I'm so sorry about what's happening to you, but in a kind of whisper, you know. And there is this thing where people agree with you, or people want to hear something a little different, and then you go out and you say it, and you turn around and everyone's gone, kind of, you know, there's nobody supporting you. So what you have are kind of like, it's like a total tribalism. If you join any tribe, no matter how crazy it is, even if it seems like the most marginal, weird opinion, you have your team, your mob, and when somebody attacks you, they will come in and defend you, you know, and they will give the appearance of your side having popular support and validity and so on. Whereas if you don't really quite belong in a political tribe, if you are trying to be a bit nuanced, as I say, you walk out and suddenly everyone's gone. You're just sort of like on your own out there. And it's really funny reading the comments too, the commentary, because they don't quite know what to do with me, you know, because they think one line she said means she's the enemy, but then this other line she said means she's one of us. And that's the way it goes. And it's just like very stupid, you know. And I just can't see, I would love to see a kind of revival of these kind of, the way public intellectuals used to be, like where you would just have kind of total eccentrics who, you know, created new ways of seeing things and didn't just kind of attach themselves to a tribe and just like hammer the other side. And it's just very tiring. It's not, it's definitely not, it's not good for public debate. And it's not like I even want everyone to be really polite. I just want to have actually interesting conversations. And that's just been made totally impossible. But as for should they be deplatformed, no, I think everyone else needs to go on there, you know, or else maybe journalists need to like, if that's not going to happen, right, and Twitter is just going to remain like a post-apocalyptic zombie movie situation where the only people left are completely crazy, then journalists are just going to have to realize that Twitter is not just not public opinion, it's the opposite to public opinion.
Do you see it changing? Do you see this, the tribalism and the nastiness of it shifting?
No. I think it'll just get worse and worse. I mean, I don't see any sign of I don't see any reason for it to get better. The one kind of little bit of hope I have is that the internet does have one tendency that I've kind of observed a bunch of times where things reach a peak, reach a point of saturation, and then people become immune to them. So, for example, I think we're nearing a point where we might have reached a peak of the effectiveness of hit piece journalism. So, it used to be that, you know, if a really bad, really humiliating hit piece was written about you in some kind of like cultural magazine or something, you know, you would just it would ruin your career and you would never recover. Whereas now, you know, within 24 hours, there's a worse hit piece on someone else. And you're forgotten. And like, if you even look back at the people who seemed like they were, you know, gonna like lose their mind with like rage at you, that they've just moved on to someone else. So it may be that it will lose its effectiveness. Fingers crossed that will happen.
Hi, Angela. Thank you so much. I'm a huge fan. I thought Kill All Normies was very, very prescient and really gives us a good blueprint for the Trump era. And this is a tactical question. We do have a generation of young people who, in terms of their political sentiment, they're really saturated in the language of culture and the culture war, and that's very familiar to them. And those concerns you articulate about, material redistribution, that's a political paradigm that they've just never really come across. So what's the prospect for outreach? How do we support people to understand some of the concerns of material left when that hasn't been their sort of, their political initiation?
Oh, thank you. That's a really great question. I don't know. I mean, that's a huge, that's a very tall order, and as I said, it's kind of against overwhelming odds, it feels like, but I also feel like it's the only worthwhile political project right now. I think part of it is, well, I guess it's kind of self-fulfilling in a way. Like, we've put so much stock in seeing, in seeing kind of the cultural realm and the debates that go on among really quite an elite kind of like strata of society as the place where politics happens. Now, politics does happen there in a way. I mean, it's certainly not unimportant. I mean, but I guess there is a kind of dislocation between that and kind of the rest of society. I mean, one of the things that I think has been true and has been a realization that needed to happen is that the kind of the rise of like figures like Trump. There's been some kind of great critics like Thomas Frank and Mark Blythe and people like that who I think have written really well about this problem of the dislocation between the world of politics, media, culture, and so on. Often small cities where everyone knows each other, and then their whole rest of society being totally disconnected. So I guess it's a case of maybe not letting the cultural pressure within those elite spaces influence people who are making political decisions, and just to be aware of that in a way that maybe we haven't for a couple of decades.
We'll go mic 2, 1, 2, 1.
Great, that was awesome. Just a question about new left, new right. Do you think this is a permanent transition? Will it come back? Another quick question is, do you think that these groups define themselves by their differences?
Define themselves by differences compared to each other, kind of, or within?
Ideological differences.
Yeah, I mean, I think, once you look into them for a little while, you see that they're not really united fronts. Like, they actually fight constantly internally, and often, like on the right, much more viciously with one another than they would with someone like me. Which is weird, They hate people who are like slightly different,
It's
like
one of the outcomes of the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville. There was a lot of people that spent a lot of time distancing themselves from each other in different groups.
Yeah.
Divided them more than united.
Yeah, I mean, it was also like the narcissism of small differences, like you hate people who are slightly to your left or slightly to your right way more than you hate someone who's kind of so far away from you politically that you weirdly are able to get along fine with them. They do. I mean, in terms of how they define themselves, like the alt-right are kind of influenced by the French New Right, who wanted to kind of fuse elements of the left and right. So, or even if you look at something like what's going on in Italy now, it's kind of like a sort of fusion of elements of the right and left. So I even remember, I think Richard Spencer saying that he wasn't even sure about calling it the alt-right because he wasn't even sure about actually taking on the word right, because they do kind of really, really, really hate conservatives, and they see conservatives as having basically just as being like cucks, right? Like they've lost everything. They keep losing to the left. They've been losing everything since '68. So they do identify as right wing, but they're also in many ways more inclined to kind of borrow styles and kind of a sense of humor and different things from the left than they would from the conservative movement, for example.
Mike one.
Hi. Sorry, Angela, I'm hiding in the corner. Hi. One of the things that you raised, really, a non-academic way to put it, is that online is just a mob culture. It's absolutely disgusting. You call it tribalism, but I see it quite menacingly like a mob. And if public discourse has moved online, but I can come up here in front of all these guys and ask a question. I wouldn't ask a question online if it was touchy, because people who can look me up online will start haranguing me, and it's absolutely horrible. So if public discourse has moved online, but people who might want to ask a question are no longer able to ask questions, then what's the future of public discourse? How can people who are idea makers or trying to shape society actually get out to talk to the general proletariat, as it were?
Yeah, well, thank you. I did a thing recently where I made a total throwaway comment. I didn't even think about it, which was I was saying something about Jordan Peterson. I just made a throwaway comment that, he's admirable in a way, and then I just moved on. And that blew up into a huge thing online. They were like, Nagle endorses Peterson and this kind of thing. And actually, politically, I really have nothing in common with Jordan Peterson. In fact, on a very fundamental level, we have less in common than almost anyone, because my criticisms are really of the kind of classical liberals in a way, which, I would count him as one. What I meant by his admirable is he became famous because he kind of went out there and was happy to be a sort of weird off-message person. And, he was willing to say things that got him in trouble. And that's kind of really all I meant, just that we need more of that. It doesn't mean I think we need people who have his exact opinions. It just means if we have lots of different people who are willing to do that from all kinds of different perspectives, that's when things will get really interesting. And also, another thing about the kind of Peterson phenomenon, and it really is a phenomenon. I mean, it sounds like you have an Irish accent. Am I hearing that right? Yeah. He spoke in Ireland recently, and he packed out this huge stadium. So if you just say, well, that's stupid and his fans are all stupid, then you're missing, what is an undeniable cultural phenomenon that is really important. He's not that many bands, world famous, would get that now, and he is almost like a kind of male self-help figure. His book is a self-help book, basically. But the thing is, one friend of mine, went there and was kind of writing about it, and she was saying that the really striking thing was most of the people actually weren't there because they were totally true believing fanboys who believed everything he said. They were actually just guys who were there at their dads, and just it was an interesting event where they wanted to hear this guy, or they weren't quite sure about what his views were. So in other words, there is this real thirst out there for something, and we're not able to fill it because we're making it so impossible to have those kind of interesting debates that should be happening, that people who would ordinarily go into that role are just going, oh, screw this, I'm going into STEM and make some money or something like that. People who are critical thinkers are actually not interested in those areas of life anymore, because it's not interesting. It's just tedious, and it's not going anywhere, and you end up having these inane conversations. So I do see hope. What I'm saying is, I see that there is definitely a thirst out there for it. We just have to produce the institutions maybe that will nurture it, something like this. And there's lots of other Intelligence Squared and different things like that. Because I don't think the universities are going to do it either. I think, in other words, we need to build public institutions that will actually not just kind of, pick a tribe and support that, but will just generally nurture interesting, open discussions. And that's kind of our best hope. But I do think there's an audience there for it.
Just by being here, you're all making the world a better place. Mike 2.
Hi, thank you for the work you've done. it's sad that you're withdrawing from the public space, because I think you've brought a lot to the discourse. How do we, not you, we bring nuance back to the debate? How do the normal, every person out there bring nuance back to the debate, move away from this extreme, like, kind of culture?
I mean, I think there's no good answer. You just have to do it and just try to remind yourself that the kind of just the relentless bad faith kind of nonsense responses that you get are not representative of the general public. They're like restaurant reviews, right? Like the general public doesn't go on and just give something a mediocre review. You get the people who say it's the worst restaurant ever, best restaurant ever, and sort of nothing in between. And it's kind of a similar principle. But it is very depressing, and it is very hard to kind of to stay there when it feels like very futile. And it's funny because when I see other friends doing that and kind of bowing out of, like, I was encouraging one friend of mine who's completely stopped writing because he was just getting these constant, completely deranged, like, responses to these very sensible things that he was writing. And to me, it seems so obvious when I was looking at, not as myself, but looking at someone else. I was like, who cares what they say? Just keep writing, keep doing what you're doing. It'll be fine. I mean, there's nothing they can really do. But when it's yourself, it's very hard to completely ignore that, or to feel having some kind of interesting feedback is the reason you do this stuff, right? Unless you're a total narcissist who just wants to talk with nobody ever talking back to you, you want to have an interesting kind of discussion. And I mean, that's what I'm saying. We have to create institutions where that's possible. And a part of it will be painful. It means you have to hear, you have to hear things that are maybe shocking or upsetting or that you don't want to hear. But unless we create those institutions, we're stuck kind of where we are.
We've got a few minutes left, so Mike 1.
Hi. So in your book, you talked about how basically, like, sort of transgression as well as youth culture to an extent, or youth subcultures and things, have been sort of idealized, and even though they're actually pretty value neutral things in and of themselves. And Mark Fisher spoke about whether we maybe need a cultural super nanny now at some point. And I was wondering whether just thinking about older people's opinion and people who actually have experience in fields and things like that is something that needs to come back into public debate, rather than just always assuming that the people who are sort of the most snot-nosed or the loudest and most transgressive are right.
So in terms of the people who need to be brought back into public debate are those who have the most kind of expertise?
Yeah, and maybe also just wisdom of age. There's no shortage of kind of older intellectuals who are really great, because they came from a time when things weren't like this. You really see it in even just the quality of I always see some kind of old, on my own side, some old leftists always in trouble for saying something. And the reason they're always in trouble is because nobody younger than them would say those things. So, for example, at the height of the post-Charlottesville kind of really intense emotional moment, Noam Chomsky just came along and said, "Oh, I think the far right should have free speech," and nobody on the left would say that now, under the age of 60 probably. Zizek is kind of an outrageous figure still. I think he must be around 70. Norman Finkelstein, who I mentioned, is one of my favorite kind of commentators. He says stuff that really, I mean, he would get banned from any left-wing organization now for saying the stuff he says. So in a way, the old guys are the people we kind of have to look to and try to have some of their bravery. And also, one thing that just really drives me crazy is, I remember saying to a friend once, I was reading Camille Paglia's first kind of big book, and I mentioned her a little bit in my book as well. Again, she's not someone I actually agree with that much politically. She's a libertarian, which I don't have a libertarian bone in my body, and she's, just kind of an eccentric figure in lots of ways, but very interesting and like very funny and like definitely worth reading. When I said I was reading her, my, political comrade or whatever said, "Why?" And I just thought, like, that is the problem. Like, the idea that just reading a political opponent is a problem that would strike anyone as weird is so, it's just such a devastating kind of sign of how bad things are,
Maybe even dangerous. Who do you think's winning the culture wars?
That's a really hard one. I think right now the kind of the Tumblr woke people are winning.
Angela, thank you so much for your time and for sharing your thoughts on what might be your last public talk. That's great, thank you. And thank you.